this morning because I was doing some background study on Ted Cruz, and I came up with a reference to a story, and I hope I can find it. Well, anyway, there's 2 or 3 Ted Cruz stories that are worth pondering because he has written a think piece, and it's in an obscure publication. It's called the Ted... I'm sorry, man. I just drifted off on you there for a second. It's the Texas Review of Law and Politics. Now, I have been on their mailing list for years. And before Ted Cruz was a big deal, before he declared his quest for the presidency, he did a little bit of writing for this review. And I was looking at this and started to chase some of the footnotes. And he makes reference in one of his articles to a Jimmy Fallon routine. It is a fake phone call. They set it up as that Obama is calling Putin, and they're trying to negotiate, and they're doing this pretend fake phone call here, and here's what it sounded like.
As we said earlier, though, everyone's been talking about the situation in Ukraine, and things are getting pretty tense over the past couple of days, and President Obama has been talking to Russian President Vladimir Putin on the phone to try and work things out. And it's so amazing here at the Tonight Show, you get access to a lot of stuff. We actually got footage.
Are you serious?
Of their most recent phone conversation.
Oh my gosh.
Check it out.
Hello? Hello, Vlad, it's Barack. I've been trying to call you all day. Where you been?
I'm sorry. I've been playing iPhone game Candy Crush. It's so addictive. I just take the candy and I crush it.
Well, I hear you. It's been quite a stressful week, I'll tell you that much.
Been pretty stressful over here, too.
Look, we got to talk about the situation in Ukraine. I mean, you invaded Crimea.
No. You got it backwards, my friend. Haven't you heard the 80s comedian Yakov Smirnoff? Everything in Russia is opposite, so technically, Crimea invade us.
Look, don't you see what you're doing, though? You're forcing people to accept something that the majority of them don't even want.
Yes, in Russia we have word for this. Obamacare.
Ouch. Now that hurt.
Yeah, does Obamacare cover burns?
Ha, very funny. And no.
So anyway, you have a word for that, Obamacare. Anyway, I was getting ready to chat with Senator Cruz. I came across a couple of other things that were brought up the last several days. He goes on with Katie Couric and talking about the Odegaard case, the same-gender marriage issue comes up. And Ted Cruz brings up an Iowa case.
Do you see this, pursuing this along legal lines, in fact, in the state of Texas, if these clerks so choose not to issue them?
I am eager to fight to defend religious liberty in every instance. Let me give you an example. A couple of weeks ago, I sat down with a couple in Iowa named Dick and Betty Odegaard. It's a delightful couple, an older couple that a number of years ago, they purchased an historic Lutheran church, a beautiful old church that was built 70, 80 years ago. And they began hosting weddings in this church, and they started a business where they would cater the weddings. They started a flower shop. They'd provide flowers. And then a couple of years ago, 2 men came in and wanted to have a gay wedding there. And the Odegaards are devout Mennonites, and they explained, they said, listen, it is contrary to our faith. We can't host a wedding that our religious faith teaches us is wrong. The next day they were sued. They went through protracted litigation. The Odegaards had to write a $5,000 check to settle the litigation and promise never again to host a wedding. When I sat down 2 weeks ago with the Odegaards, they told me they're going out of business this summer. So their employees that had worked for them, they're having to lay them all off. and they're being persecuted for their religious faith. There is on the left an intolerance, whatever happened to tolerance and diversity, driving these people of faith out of business because they refuse to embrace something contrary to our faith. The First Amendment is protecting the right of you or me or all of us.
I guess if it trumps equality and fairness, I think that's when people have an issue with that.
But Katie, let me suggest under the First Amendment, there is a reason religious liberty is the first protection in the First Amendment. Society has no right to force a Jewish rabbi to perform a Christian wedding ceremony. Society has no right to force a Muslim imam to perform a Jewish wedding ceremony. We are a nation, the history of this country. We were founded by people fleeing religious oppression and coming to a new land where every one of us could seek out God with all of our hearts, minds, and souls without government getting in the way, that we could live according to our conscience and our faith. And this decision last week is a profound threat to the religious liberty of millions of men and women who want to follow, whether they're Christians, whether they're Jews, whether they're Muslims, regardless of their faith, Catholics, Protestants, Mormons. This sets up the government going after those for whom faith is real. And that's wrong.
That is one of the most concise and brilliant explanations of the dangers of what happened last week at the Supreme Court level. That was an eloquent response, using a powerful example from right here in our own backyard. I was also, as I was telling you earlier, getting ready to chat with Senator Cruz, and I did a little bit more homework, and Katie Couric was trying to pin him down on the fact that he was born in Canada.
You were born in Canada. Do you think that's going to be an issue for voters? Because when we did solicit questions on Twitter, many people pointed that out. I know your mother is a U.S. citizen, was a U.S. citizen when you were born. But people seem to have a problem with that.
Well, you know, it's interesting. The whole birther thing was started by the Hillary Clinton campaign in 2008 against Barack Obama. And I recognize that there are folks online that like to push that issue. I'll tell you, as a legal matter, the law is quite clear that the child of a U.S. citizen born abroad is a citizen by birth, is a natural-born citizen. My mother was born in Wilmington, Delaware. I was born in Canada, in Calgary, because my parents were working in the oil and gas industry. And under federal law, the child of a U.S. citizen, if you or I travel abroad and we have a child abroad, that child is a citizen by birth. And it's actually come up multiple times in history. So, for example, John McCain was born in Panama, but he was a citizen by birth because his parents were American citizens. George Romney, Mitt's dad, who ran for president in '68, he was born in Mexico. His parents were Mormon missionaries.
So you're basically saying you don't believe it's an issue at all?
I think there will be some politically who try to push it as an issue, but as a legal matter, it is quite straightforward. The third example, by the way, that's kind of interesting, is Barry Goldwater, who was born in Arizona before Arizona was a state. But he was a natural-born citizen because his parents were citizens.
Now, that was Senator Ted Cruz on with Katie Couric the other day, and I was listening to several other interviews. It's fascinating, Senator Ted Cruz, how you almost have to do somersaults and wave your hands in front of these people's eyes, actually get them to talk about issues.
Well, good morning, Jan. You're exactly right. I mean, anytime you're interviewing with the mainstream media, they have a partisan agenda, and anyone who doesn't understand that they are Barack Obama's Praetorian Guard protecting the president, and that no one is more ready for Hillary than the mainstream media. Anyone who doesn't understand that isn't prepared to deal with them. And I think the way to deal with them is to tell the truth, but do it with a smile. And, you know, that interview you were just playing there with Katie Couric, but when I pointed out that the entire birther movement started with Hillary Clinton's primary campaign against Obama, I'm pretty sure she visibly twitched on air.
Yes, she did.
And yeah, we need to be happy warriors and speak the truth, and that's what so few Republicans have been willing or able to do.
Over the next several days, we have been told that the United States is supposed to be at high alert. We've been given security issued warnings. Homeland Security says this weekend upcoming Prophet Muhammad drawing event scheduled in the coming week. We should expect a bumpy ride. Have you been briefed on any of this, and what do you think about it?
I have not received a classified briefing that is different from the public announcement. What I would say is, look, there is every reason to be concerned and take these threats seriously. Radical Islamic terrorism is on the rise, and one of the significant factors in the rise of radical Islamic terrorism has been the inability and the unwillingness of the Obama-Clinton-Kerry foreign policy to take it seriously, to confront it, or for that matter, even to call it by its name. I mean, we've seen just in the past few days radical Islamic terrorist attacks in Tunisia, in Egypt. We're seeing, and yet consistently, this administration not only refuses to acknowledge what we're fighting, but the commander-in-chief is unwilling and unable to lead a serious effort to destroy and defeat radical Islamic terrorism. That's what it's going to take.
I'm not sure they're even capable of using the phrase Islamic terrorism.
They have systematically scrubbed their vocabulary of it. Not only does the president not use that phrase, but the entire administration, it is apparently prohibited to acknowledge it as radical Islamic terrorism. If you remember back a number of months ago, the terrorist attack in Paris, where the president astonishingly referred to that as a, quote, random act of violence. Jan, when a radical Islamist with a butcher knife goes into a kosher deli to murder Jews because of their Jewish faith, that's not random. That is a naked act of anti-Semitism. When 22 Coptic Christians are beheaded by ISIS, the president and the White House put out a statement simply acknowledging that they were murdered because of their Egyptian citizenship. That is absolutely not why they were murdered. As Pope Francis powerfully observed, their blood confesses Jesus Christ. And on Good Friday, we were all horrified when 147 Christians were murdered in Kenya. Al-Shabaab, a radical terrorist group, Islamic terrorist group, crossed over into Kenya. And just to make it abundantly clear for this administration, they sorted among those they captured. If you were Muslim, you were spared. If you were Christian, they shot you in the back of the head execution style. And yet, if you go and read the White House's statement on the massacre in Kenya, you will search in vain for any reference to the word Christian or Islam. And we have got to speak the truth. This Orwellian doublespeak is only helping ISIS and helping the radical Islamic terrorists.
Just a little bit of background here. I sort of got radicalized on a subject back during the Vietnam War when I was just first starting out in broadcasting in Wisconsin. In the height of the Vietnam War, I went to a lecture at college, and they brought in Angela Davis to speak. And the first thing she said out of her mouth was, "I am a communist." Now, I'm grown up in the Cold War. That was about as a shocking and subversive admission that I've ever seen. And I said, wait a second. Here taxpayers are paying money to bring this dullard communist to speak to a bunch of college kids in Wisconsin. While we're over in Southeast Asia trying to protect them from communism, we are granting tenure to communists at university in the United States. I'm similarly cynical about our war against radical Islam in Afghanistan and in Iraq, while we have the door open here in our own backyard and literally importing people from terrorist states who have Islamist ties, and we're using the refugee program to import even more from Syria and Iraq. Why shouldn't we become cynical at the government of the United States won't even label Islamist terrorism for what it is, as you just eloquently stated. I'm a little skeptical about our wars abroad if we leave the porch light on for radical Islamists here at home.
Jan, you have every reason to be skeptical. This is an administration that will not acknowledge what we're fighting, will not take the fight to them, and that failure to acknowledge it has real consequences. So, for example, a few months ago, I went to the ceremony at Fort Hood in Texas, where they finally awarded the Purple Hearts to the 14 innocent souls who were murdered by Nidal Hassan.
Workplace violence, wasn't it?
That's exactly right. Nidal Hassan walked through Fort Hood yelling Aloha Akbar as he shot people, 14 innocent souls, including an unborn child. He did so after communicating with a radical Islamic cleric inquiring about the permissibility of waging jihad on his fellow soldiers. He has declared since his allegiance to the Islamic State. And throughout it all, the Obama administration insists it is just workplace violence. You know, last year in the Senate, I introduced legislation mandating that the Purple Heart be awarded in Fort Hood. And in the Senate Armed Services Committee, I was very proud to get support of both Republicans and Democrats to pass that legislation over the active opposition of the Obama Pentagon. They did not want to acknowledge this was Islamic terrorism. Fortunately, Congress overruled them. We passed that into law, the legislation I authored last year. And this spring at the ceremony, when I greeted the families of each of those who had lost loved ones, all I could say to them was, I'm sorry. I'm sorry it took 5 years to recognize the sacrifice that your husband, that your son, that your brother, that your mom gave for our nation. And it's this administration is not serious about defeating radical Islamic terrorism. They don't even acknowledge it. And as a result, radical Islamic terrorism is on the rise, and the safety and security of Americans, of Israelis, of Europeans, of our allies is all tremendously compromised by a commander-in-chief unwilling and unable to defend this nation.
But given your family heritage and background, the president, the statement yesterday, I want you to comment on this lasts about 20 seconds, and you are uniquely qualified to give a response to this.
Americans and Cubans alike are ready to move forward. I believe it's time for Congress to do the same. And I've called on Congress to take steps to lift the embargo that prevents Americans from traveling or doing business in Cuba. We've already seen members from both parties begin that work. After all, why should Washington stand in the way of our own people? Yes, there are those who want to turn back the clock and double down on a policy of isolation, but it's long past time for us to realize that this approach doesn't work. It hasn't worked for 50 years.
If you were standing there, what would you have said?
The words coming out of the president's mouth simply aren't true. And this is the latest manifestation in the repeated failures of the Obama-Clinton-Kerry foreign policy that consistently alienates our friends and appeases our enemies. This is the same approach that he's taking with Cuba, that he's taken with respect to Russia, with respect to Iran. You know, Jan, this week I have a new book that came out, A Time for Truth. And in the book, I endeavor to shine the light on what's happening in Washington, what's happening behind closed doors in the Senate, what's happening behind closed doors at the U.S. Supreme Court. But one of the things I discuss is my family story in great detail. I discuss my father's time fighting in the Cuban Revolution, being imprisoned, being tortured in Cuba. I discuss my aunt, my tia Sonia, fighting against Castro in the counter-revolution, being imprisoned and tortured by Castro. And I also, in front of each chapter, feature a truth teller, someone who I admire, who stood up with great courage and told the truth, often at great personal sacrifice. The first truth teller featured in that book is a Cuban dissident named Guillermo Farina, he used to be a Cuban, one of Castro's soldiers. And he went to the Soviet Union to study communism, and someone smuggled him a copy of George Orwell's book, Animal Farm. And it touched him powerfully. It made him realize the oppression he was seeing in his home nation of Cuba. He became a dissident. He's been imprisoned. He's gone on hunger strikes. He's been tortured. Guillermo Fariñas and another Cuban dissident, Elizardo Sanchez, both came to the United States about a year ago. I interviewed them both for about an hour in Spanish. They told their stories about how the Castros are practicing what they call Putinismo, which is basically the strategy of Vladimir Putin to appear to moderate while tightening their grips of totalitarian oppression. They said Cuba is a giant prison, and they predicted Obama would do what he's doing, which is allow billions of dollars to flow into the coffers of Fidel Castro and Raul Castro, which they will use to murder and torture their citizens, and they will use to export terrorism throughout Latin America. It makes no sense to be strengthening a profoundly anti-American enemy, a tyrant 90 miles from the U.S. shore.
Senator Ted Cruz, before we go, I'd like to thank you for your eloquent defense of religious liberty, talking with Katie Couric, and when you brought up the Odegaard case here in Iowa and asserted this is a religious liberty issue, and I thank you for your stand on that. That is probably the best response I've seen from the political class on that Supreme Court ruling. That was profound and excellent, sir.
Well, Jan, thank you very much, and thank you for your passionate and continued defense of religious liberty. As you know, it has never been more imperiled than it is right now. We are seeing an outright onslaught on the First Amendment, on religious liberty. We're seeing an onslaught on Bible-believing Christians. We're seeing an onslaught on Orthodox Jews. We're seeing an onslaught on Mormons. We're seeing an onslaught on the Catholic Church, on anyone who would exercise their religious faith and live according to the precepts of their faith and their conscience. This administration has effectively declared war. At the oral argument in the marriage case, as you know, Justice Alito asked the Obama Solicitor General, if you prevail, is the next step for the IRS to go after Christian universities and, by extension, Christian grade schools, Christian charities, even Christian churches? And the Obama administration, the Department of Justice said, yes, that's a very real possibility. I'll tell you this, I've spent 2 decades fighting to defend religious liberty over and over and over again, and I will never, ever, ever shy from defending the religious liberty of every American, and I'm convinced 2016 is going to turn on, it is going to be the religious liberty election.
Senator Ted Cruz, thank you for your time this morning, sir.
Thank you, my friend.
You bet. Bye-bye.